The courtroom was packed, buzzing with tension. Reporters whispered among themselves, cameras flashed, and the murmur of the crowd filled the air like a storm brewing on the horizon. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. Sitting at the defendant's table, bruised and battered, was none other than the newly appointed police chief, Chief Malcolm Carter. His uniform was torn, his face swollen, and yet his eyes burned with something even stronger than pain. Justice. Just hours earlier, Malcolm had walked into that very courthouse with his head held high, ready to testify in a corruption case that had rocked the city. For months, he had been investigating a group of officers within his own department, men who had sworn to protect and serve, but had instead used their badges as shields for cruelty and abuse. He had uncovered enough evidence to expose their crimes, and today was supposed to be the day they answered for their actions. But what happened next, no one saw coming. Before he could even take the stand, before he could utter a single word, those same officers, still wearing their uniforms, cornered him in the hallway outside the courtroom. No cameras, no witnesses, just the raw abuse of power in its most terrifying form. They thought they could silence him. They thought that beating him down would make him afraid. They were wrong. Now, as Malcolm sat in that courtroom, broken but unshaken, the judge banged the gavel to regain order. The defense attorneys for the accused officers scrambled to explain, spinning lies about a misunderstanding, a scuffle that had gotten out of hand. But the truth was there for everyone to see. The new chief, the man who had dared to stand up against corruption, had been attacked by the very people he was trying to hold accountable. The question now was, would justice truly be served? Would the system protect its own, or would the weight of the truth be too much to ignore? And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, something happened that left everyone in the room stunned. What unfolded next? No one could have predicted. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. The judge's gavel still echoed through the room, but no one dared to move. Chief Malcolm Carter sat still, his breathing steady despite the pain. His swollen lip, the cut above his eyebrow, and the bruises forming along his cheekbone told a story louder than words ever could. Yet, even with all eyes on him, he didn't flinch. He had faced worse before. Across the room, the officers who had attacked him sat in their uniforms, their faces stone cold, their hands folded like nothing had happened. Some exchanged glances, a silent message passing between them. They had done what they thought needed to be done. Now, they waited to see if the system would back them up like it always had before. Malcolm had spent his whole career believing in justice. He had climbed the ranks the right way, refusing shortcuts, refusing corruption. He knew the city wasn't perfect. He knew there were officers who had let power twist them, turn them into something dangerous. But he had also believed that truth, when exposed, could change things. That was why he had accepted the position of police chief, even when he knew it wouldn't be easy. He wasn't just stepping into a department, he was stepping into a battlefield. And now it was clear just how far some people were willing to go to keep things the way they were. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda Hayes, finally stood up, clearing her throat. "Your Honor, I request an immediate investigation into what happened outside this courtroom." Her voice was steady, but there was a fire behind it. She turned toward the officers sitting across from her, her gaze unwavering. The victim in this case is not just any witness, he is the police chief. And if this can happen to him, in broad daylight, inside a courthouse, then what does that say about the safety of anyone else who dares to speak out? The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Malcolm, as if searching for some confirmation. "Chief Carter, do you wish to make a statement?" For a moment, Malcolm didn't respond. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, the unspoken warning hanging in the air. If he chose to speak, if he named names, if he exposed everything right here and now, there was no turning back. Then again, there never had been. He slowly stood up, ignoring the pain shooting through his ribs. He looked at the judge, then at the officers across from him, then finally at the crowd watching. "Your Honor," he said, his voice strong, I came here today to bring the truth into the light, but it seems there are those who will do anything to keep it buried. He paused, letting his words settle. I will make my statement, but I want every single person in this courtroom to hear it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The judge hesitated, then gave a small nod. Proceed. But before Malcolm could say another word, the doors to the courtroom swung open. A man in a dark suit hurried inside, his face pale, his eyes filled with urgency. He rushed to the prosecutor's table, whispering something in Linda Hayes' ear. She stiffened, her hand gripping the table as her expression darkened. The tension in the room tightened like a rope about to snap. Malcolm could see it. Something had changed, something big. And whatever it wasn't over yet. Linda Hayes turned slowly toward Malcolm, her expression unreadable. The words whispered in her ear had changed something. He could see it in her eyes. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just about him anymore. Malcolm clenched his jaw. He had seen cover-ups before, but this felt different. More desperate. More dangerous. The judge tapped his gavel again. Miss Hayes, do you need a moment? She straightened, her professional demeanor slipping back into place like armor. No, Your Honor. She turned to face Malcolm, then the courtroom. Before Chief Carter gives his statement, I need to request a brief recess. There's been a development. A murmur spread through the room. The officers sitting across from Malcolm didn't react much, but he could tell they were paying attention. Whatever Linda had just learned, they wanted to know too. The judge frowned. This is highly unusual. I understand, Linda said, but it's necessary. The judge studied her for a moment, then let out a slow breath. 10-minute recess. He slammed the gavel. We resume promptly. As soon as the judge stood up, people in the audience began whispering among themselves. Malcolm exhaled sharply, his ribs aching as he turned toward Linda. She was already moving, heading for a side door, motioning for him to follow. He didn't hesitate. As they stepped into the hallway, Linda immediately lowered her voice. That was an agent from Internal Affairs. Malcolm tensed. What'd he say? She hesitated, then looked him directly in the eyes. Someone inside the department just tried to erase the evidence you gathered. His stomach dropped. What? They wiped everything, every report, every file. It's like it never existed. Malcolm's mind raced. He had spent months compiling the evidence, making sure there were backups, securing statements from victims. He had been careful, and yet, someone had managed to make it disappear. His jaw tightened. I have copies. Linda nodded, but there was something else in her expression. They know that. The words settled heavily between them. This wasn't just about protecting the officers on trial. It was bigger. Someone with serious power wanted this case buried. Someone willing to go to extreme lengths to make sure Malcolm never got the chance to expose the truth. Before Malcolm could respond, the hallway door swung open again. A young officer, one of the few Malcolm actually trusted, rushed in, his face pale. Chief, he panted, you need to leave. Now. Malcolm stiffened. What are you talking about? The officer glanced around nervously, lowering his voice. There's an order to detain you. Linda's head snapped up. What? The officer swallowed hard. They're saying you obstructed justice, that you tampered with evidence. Malcolm felt his pulse thunder in his ears. They were turning it on him, framing him. Linda's expression darkened. They're trying to take him out of the picture. The officer nodded quickly. You don't have much time. I don't know who's pulling the strings, but they want you gone before this trial continues. Malcolm exhaled sharply. He had seen setups like this before, just never aimed at him. For the first time, he wondered if he had underestimated just how deep this corruption ran. And if he had just walked straight into a trap. Malcolm's mind raced. This was a setup, carefully planned, perfectly timed. If they arrested him now, it wouldn't just ruin the case. It would destroy his credibility. By the time he proved his innocence, the officers he was trying to expose would be long gone, free to continue their corruption without fear. Linda was already pulling out her phone. "I need to make a call." The officer who had warned them shook his head quickly. "No time. They're coming now." Malcolm exhaled, steadying himself. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't the streets. This wasn't an armed suspect or a tense standoff. This was something more insidious, an attack from within. He had two choices: stay and face the charges or disappear long enough to expose the truth. Linda let out a slow breath beside him. "We did it." Malcolm looked at the flash drive still in his hand. For now. The young officer who had saved them, who had risked everything, stepped closer. "You're right, this isn't over." He lowered his voice. "They weren't the only ones involved. There are others, higher up." Malcolm nodded. He had suspected as much. The FBI agent who had spoken earlier turned to Malcolm. "We'll take it from here, but we'll need that drive." Malcolm hesitated for half a second before handing it over. He had done what he could. Now, it was up to them. As the FBI wrapped up the arrests, Malcolm and Linda stood by the water, watching it all unfold. Linda finally broke the silence. "So what now?" Malcolm exhaled, the weight of everything settling over him. "Now, we make sure this never happens again." She gave him a small, knowing smile. "That sounds like a fight for another day." Malcolm let himself smile, just a little. "Yeah, but when that day comes, we'll be ready." The young officer stepped up beside them, staring out at the water. "For what it's worth, Chief, I joined this job to protect people, not to be part of something dirty." Malcolm nodded. "Then you're exactly the kind of cop this city needs." The officer seemed to stand a little taller at those words. As the last of the corrupt officers were loaded into the FBI vans, Malcolm felt the first real sense of relief he had in weeks. The truth had come out. Justice, in some form, had been served. But he also knew this was just one battle in a much bigger war. He turned to Linda. "Come on, let's get out of here." She chuckled. "You buying the first round?" Malcolm smirked. "Depends. You paying for the second?" They walked away from the chaos together, the city lights glowing in the distance. Tonight, they had won. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, they'd be ready for whatever came next. Then, just as he was about to make his next move, his phone vibrated in his pocket. A message. He pulled it out, his heart pounding as he read the words on the screen. Asterisk, asterisk, we have the real files. Meet me at Pier 17. Trust no one, asterisk, asterisk. Malcolm's breath caught. This wasn't over. Not even close. Malcolm didn't have time to question the message. He glanced up at the officers blocking the stairwell, then back down the hallway behind him. More footsteps echoed in the distance. They were closing in. If he and Linda didn't move now, there wouldn't be another chance. He turned to her, lowering his voice. Pier 17. Someone has the real files. Her eyes widened, but she didn't hesitate. Then we need to get out of here. Malcolm's mind worked fast. They were trapped between two threats, officers in front of them and more coming from behind. There was only one option left. "The window," he said. Linda followed his gaze. At the end of the hallway, a narrow window overlooked the alley behind the courthouse. It was high, but not impossible. They ran. "Stop them." Reed's voice thundered behind them. The officers moved, but Malcolm and Linda were faster. He reached the window first, throwing it open just as the first officer grabbed for him. Linda climbed through without hesitation, landing hard on the pavement below. Malcolm swung his legs over the edge, but before he could jump, a hand grabbed his shoulder. "Where do you think you're going?" the officer growled. Malcolm twisted, driving his elbow back into the man's ribs. The officer grunted in pain, his grip loosening just enough. Malcolm yanked free and dropped. The impact sent pain shooting up his legs, but he ignored it. "Run," Linda shouted. They took off down the alley. Behind them, officers scrambled to get through the window, but it gave them a head start. They reached the street, breathless, scanning for a way out. A motorcycle was parked at the curb. Malcolm didn't know who it belonged to, but at that moment he didn't care. He jumped on, revved the engine, and reached for Linda's hand. She hesitated for half a second before climbing on behind him. Tires screeched as they sped away, sirens blaring in the distance. Pier 17 wasn't far, but every second counted. If this was a setup, they were riding straight into it. But if it was real, if the files were truly there, it was their only shot. As they neared the docks, Malcolm spotted a figure standing by the water. Hood pulled up, hands in pockets. The moment they arrived, the person turned. Malcolm's breath caught. It was the young officer who had stayed behind at the courthouse. He was alive. "You made it," the officer said, his voice low. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. "Everything's here, every file, every report, the backups they didn't know about." Malcolm took it, gripping it tightly. This was it, the proof they needed. But before he could say another word, headlights flooded the dock. Black SUVs skidded to a stop, doors flying open. Officers poured out, weapons drawn. Linda cursed under her breath. They found us. Malcolm looked at the flash drive, then at the ocean beside them. He had seconds to decide. Then, just as the officers moved in, a new set of sirens roared to life. But these weren't from the corrupt cops. FBI vehicles swarmed in from the other side, red and blue lights flashing. For the first time, Malcolm saw fear flicker across Captain Reed's face as the federal agents stepped out. The young officer exhaled. "I called them," he said quietly. Malcolm tightened his grip on the drive. The truth was finally coming out. But just when he thought it was over, Reed took a step forward, his face twisting into a smirk. "You really think this ends here?" he said. And in that moment, Malcolm knew this was only the beginning. The tension on the docks was thick. For a moment, no one moved. FBI agents stood firm, their weapons aimed at the corrupt officers. Malcolm could see it in their faces: panic, anger, the realization that their power was slipping away. Captain Reed's smirk didn't fade, but there was something different in his eyes now. He knew he had lost. One of the federal agents stepped forward. "Captain Reed, you and your officers are under investigation for obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and abuse of power." His voice was calm, firm. "You can come quietly, or we can do this the hard way." For a second, Malcolm thought Reed might resist, might try something desperate, but then slowly he raised his hands. The others followed. The sight of them being cuffed, led toward the FBI vehicles, should have felt like victory. But Malcolm knew better. This wasn't the end. Corruption like this didn't start and end with a few bad cops. It ran deeper. Linda's voice cut through the tension. "We need to get him out of here." The young officer hesitated. "There's a back exit through the records office. If we move now, we can slip out before they reach the hallway." Malcolm didn't like running, but he had no choice. He nodded. "Let's go." The three of them moved fast, weaving through the courthouse corridors. Every passing uniform made Malcolm's heart pound harder. How many of them were in on it? Who could he trust? As they reached the records office, Linda pushed open the door, glancing over her shoulder. "Coast is clear." They stepped inside. Rows of filing cabinets stretched toward the back exit. The officer led the way, checking the hallway beyond. "It's open," he whispered. But before they could move, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind them. Malcolm turned. The door they had come through slammed shut. Standing in front of it were two officers, ones Malcolm recognized. They were part of the same corrupt group he had been investigating. One of them, a tall man with a sharp jawline, smirked. "Going somewhere, Chief." Linda's hand tightened around her phone. "This is obstruction. If you lay a hand on him." The officer's smirk didn't fade. "You're the one sneaking out the back door. Makes it look like you've got something to hide." Malcolm stepped forward. "I'm not playing this game." The officer tilted his head as if amused. You already are, you just don't know the rules. The other officer reached for his radio. We've got him, he muttered. Malcolm's pulse spiked. He could see it happening. The headlines, the scandal, the trial falling apart before it even started. Linda whispered, we have to move. Now. The young officer, still by the back exit, met Malcolm's gaze. I can hold them off, he said quietly, but you have to go. Malcolm's stomach twisted. He hated leaving anyone behind, but he also knew this wasn't about him anymore. It was about the truth. And if he got caught now, the truth would never come out. The officers blocking the door stepped closer, their hands hovering near their weapons. The tension in the room was suffocating. Then, in a split second, everything erupted at once. Before Malcolm could react, the young officer made the first move. He grabbed a stack of case files from a nearby desk and flung them into the air. Papers scattered everywhere, filling the room like a sudden storm. The two corrupt officers instinctively flinched, their hands snapping up to block their faces. That was all the time Malcolm needed. Go, the officer shouted. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He pushed forward, grabbing Linda's arm as they bolted for the back exit. The officers behind them recovered quickly. Stop them, one of them barked. Malcolm heard the shuffle of feet, the sound of a struggle behind him. His chest tightened. The young officer had stayed behind, buying them time. But for how long? They burst into the back hallway, the cool air of the courthouse basement rushing past them. Linda pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed. We need backup, she muttered. Malcolm didn't slow down. They needed to get out of the building first. But as they reached the stairwell leading to the ground level, something made him stop cold. A shadow moved at the top of the stairs, then another. More officers. Waiting. Linda saw them too. They knew we'd come this way. Malcolm clenched his jaw. It was a trap, again. They had been one step ahead the entire time. He looked around, searching for another way out. But before he could move, one of the officers at the top of the stairs spoke. You really thought you could outrun this? Malcolm recognized the voice. It belonged to Captain Reed, one of the highest-ranking officers in the department. He was supposed to be neutral, someone who stayed out of politics. But now, standing there with his arms crossed, it was clear whose side he was on. Malcolm took a slow breath. I don't know what you've been promised, Captain, but you don't want to be on the wrong side of this. Reed chuckled, shaking his head. You don't get it, do you? This isn't about sides. It's about survival. His smile faded. You think you're the first one to try and clean up this department, the first one to expose what's really going on. He shook his head. They all thought they could win too. Malcolm felt the weight of those words settle over him. How many had come before him? How many had tried and failed? Linda gripped his arm. We can't let them stop us, she whispered. Malcolm exhaled slowly. She was right. No matter how deep this went, no matter how many people were involved, the truth still mattered. He glanced over his shoulder. The hallway behind them was still clear, but not for long.